Newsfirst Newsline with Faraz Shaukat Ali.
And top of the morning to you, this is Newsline. We're live from the Newsfirst studios in Dawson Street in Colombo. And amidst a ambience of politics and more politics, we thought we'll leave that alone for a moment, but it's all there. And we thought we'd talk about another topic that is rather contentious, it always has been, the energy security of our country and what is the least cost method of obtaining that security energy-wise. We've got here an energy specialist, former chairman of many things, including the Sri Lanka Ports Authority, the Board of Investment, the Petroleum Resources Development Agency. Salia Wickramasuriya is right here. Very good morning to you, Mr. Wickramasuriya.
Good morning, Faraz.
And thank you very much for being on Newsline. I'm going to ask you a question which must be on our collective minds for the last 70 odd years, and that is how does one achieve energy security for the country in the least cost method, and why is it that 71 years later we are still struggling with power cuts, sporadic power, nothing called a sort of clean supply constantly. Power cuts are, you have to build it into your business plans, into your daily lives and so on. Why is that? What's going wrong?
So the whole thing starts with what kind of policy the government adopts,
Right.
What objectives that policy has, what the policy purports to bring to the nation in terms of energy cost, energy affordability, and choice also is one factor. That policy translates itself into a generation plan executed in this case by the state monopoly, which is the CV.
Mm-hmm.
And then that plan is implemented.
Right.
The implementation of that plan is by law regulated by the Public Utility Services Commission, which requires disclosure of all necessary factors for computing the various numbers required to make decisions. But that system is supposed to be how it works, but it doesn't seem to function too well at the moment.
It doesn't seem to function at all. We've got all sorts of solutions, but we have an installed capacity of about 4,000.
Approximately 4.5 gigawatts if you
Right.
take into account all forms of generation.
Right, and how much of that do we use at peak times then?
2.5.
Also, we have a pretty, is that a reasonable?
So there's a difference between installed capacity and dispatchable energy.
Okay.
Some of the installed capacity is not dispatchable all the time.
Is that
But-
things like?
Say, for example, solar is not dispatchable
Okay.
at night without storage.
okay.
Wind is not dispatchable when there's no wind.
Okay.
And some generating plants take a time to come online.
Right.
So essentially, we still nevertheless do have enough dispatchable power right now, especially with the monsoons and the rains and
Yeah.
hydropower kicking in, to dispatch our needs. Our peak load needs are approximately 2.5 gigawatts, and I stand to be corrected on this. But in the night, we actually come down to around 1 gigawatt
Okay.
dispatch.
And why is electricity rates so high? I'm sure the public out there want to know why the rates per unit are so high.
So there's no simple answer to that question, Faraz, but may we take away the smoke and mirrors stage by stage?
Yeah.
Let's discuss for the moment some recent developments in the
Yes.
sector in terms of some cabinet papers submitted to the Honourable Cabinet of Ministers by the Ministry of Power and Renewable Energy. Let's start with a very innocuous one,
Yeah.
seemingly harmless paper, which seeks to increase what they call the reserve margin
Right.
from where it is now, which is between 2.5% and 20% to 25%.
Right.
Now, to understand the significance of that request, you've got to know what reserve margin is. Now, reserve margin is also called operating margin.
Yeah.
it is that amount of surplus dispatchable power that must be in a system to account for the failure of large power plants.
Right.
There needs to be a little extra.
So this is this reserve margin is that little extra.
That little extra. So now in this case, if you
It's
have
got
a
to be
peak,
dispatchable.
it's got to be dispatchable.
Right.
If your peak is 2.5 gigawatts
Yeah.
peak load, and at the time of peak load, if your largest power plant, which is 300 megawatts, shuts down, then you need to have on reserve approximately the value of the largest power plant plus a little extra.
Right.
So that's 300 plus a bit.
Right.
So out of 2.5 gigs, a 10% reserve margin is ample.
Right.
Maybe 10-12%,
Right.
let's say, to take into account what needs to be put back into the grid immediately to cater for the shortfall. Now, what this paper wishes to do, and that's the fact, our peak is 25 or 2.5, and our largest single generator is 300.
Right.
The chances of that going down all of a sudden, they're not zero, but they're small. Nevertheless, the system is managed to take into account that possibility.
Right.
Now, if you increase the reserve margin to 25%, what you're doing is you're building into the generation plan, because this reserve margin is calculated by the utility commission,
Right.
the regulator.
Right.
It is fed into the utility or utilities. In Sri Lanka's case, there's only one.
Yeah.
And the utilities plan their generation accordingly,
Yeah.
because keep in mind that as your dispatchable power increases with respect to the size of the power plant, the percentage drops. Say, for example, your largest power plant is 300 megawatts, but you're dispatching 6,000 megawatts, then that's just a 5% requirement.
Right.
So as a result, this over time and with size of grid and size of market, the percentage requirement tends to drop.
Right.
In a large grid like California, for example, the reserve margin is 6.
Okay.
Operational margin is 6. Now, there's a little technicality here about the operational margin consists of two components. One is one that can be simply added by speeding up what's already turning, if you like. It's called the spinning reserve. And then there's a supplemental reserve that can be quickly fired up and started.
Right.
So point being here is that the request has been made recently to increase the reserve margin for 25%.
Right.
Now, what that does is it requires planners to build in extra capacity.
Yeah.
Extra capacity has extra cost. So when you factor in the additional cost and you factor into account that many of these plants now with additional dispatchable power,
Yeah.
the actual dispatch of each plant drops. You
Yeah.
reduce the plant load factor. You're putting an economic strain on the country, especially when we should be going the other way, which is why the PUCSL has initially set the lowest at 2.5%, which is future looking,
Right.
and the highest currently at 10%, at 20%,
Right.
which in my humble opinion is plenty. But the interesting part of that is that there's a letter from the CEB
Yeah.
to the Secretary of the Ministry of Power, and it refers to, it is required to amend the reserve margin requirements of Gazette notification approximately to accommodate this request made by the Ministry.
Right.
So this request to increase reserve margin is not coming from the CEB, neither is it coming from the regulator, but it's coming from the Ministry. So a question to ask would be, who in the Ministry has the technical wherewithal
Yeah.
to make this calculation and make it a requirement worthy of taking to the cabinet?
So what you're saying is that this is something that should come, if at all, should be coming from the CEB or from the PUCSL?
From the PUCSL, whose role in Sri Lanka is to approve long-term generation plans, issue the guidelines that are required to construct them. It could also come from the CEB, who foresees certain risks and inform the PUCSL of those risks, and the PUCSL agrees with them and modifies the reserve margin. But my point here is that there's plenty of room in the reserve margin. The only potential need to increase this reserve margin is the requirement to put more plants into the plan.
And on Newsline here, we encourage you to send us your questions by SMS 0772 300 305. And as soon as Control gets their act together, they'll play it on your screen. 0772 300 305 by SMS, please. And just for the record, we are in conversation with Mr. Salia Wickramasuriya, former chairman of SLPA, former chairman BOI, and in essence an energy specialist with lots of expertise in petroleum. But obviously things couldn't have got, I mean, if this is one indication. But we have seen that, is that the only watchdog? Are they the only people who should be doing this? Could it be better?
Yes, so that's where the value of public oversight comes in.
Right.
And historically, public oversight has been weak into this sector because, first of all, there haven't been any private sector participants in it. The state has taken care of the provision of both connectivity and power to its citizens and has done so very successfully for a long number of, for many years. But subsequent to the 1996 dislocations due to drought, private power producers entered the scene. And while the state retains control of the transmission, actually the state retains control of the transmission and the dispatch as well as the generation, because the power purchase, the independent power producers sell to the state and the state sells on.
Right.
So
we've got
from that point.
So private, I've got a note to say that so private power plants, they play pretty important role.
Yes, they do.
They have a significant.
They have a significant role, and they should do, because private power plants balance the load because they are of a different mix typically to the state power plants. The state power plants tend to be the larger hydro and the larger coal plants.
Right.
The smaller power plants tend to be part of the reserve we talked about earlier.
Right.
Which is why, for several reasons, you've got to question another recent request to the Cabinet of Ministers to expand the capacity of the Norochale coal plant.
Right.
The Cabinet paper here is before me, and I have a couple of questions to raise from this.
Right.
It says that the power plant, the Lakvijay power plant, has saved nearly 441 billion rupees to the country during the last 8.5 years. That is said based on two premises. One is it's comparing it to if diesel were used as the alternative, which is a highly unrealistic comparison because diesel is hardly used in any country other than island nations, small island nations. So the comparison of the coal power plant against diesel is a little optimistic.
Right.
Also, it goes on to say that the operational cost of an electricity unit maintained from this plant in 2018 is rupees 7.64. That is approximately half of the actual cost of coal only. Now, at $100 per ton, and the efficiencies and energy equivalent numbers used, that alone, the cost of the coal alone burnt per unit is at about 9 rupees. The PUCSL number for 2017 is cost of fuel plus O&M 14. 14 versus 7.64.
So is this a mistake? Is it?
I don't know. Here it's 7.64, the actual is 14. That changes this comparison. Not that that's the key point either.
Yeah.
But it goes on to talk about the fact that because Norochale already has a coal plant, that an extension to that can be built quickly.
Is that feasible? Is that?
Again, I think, as far as I'm aware, that an EIA, which is an environmental impact assessment, is not location specific but project specific.
Right.
So if the impact is going to change, my feeling, and I've had this verified by a few other sources, is that a new EIA has to happen. Now, when a new EIA happens, as Dr. Nishan Dimel recently pointed out in last week's Energy Forum, has to be this, the planning of the inclusion of this has to take place according to the principles of PESTEL, which is political, economic, social, technical, environmental, and legal.
Right.
Now, all of those factors go into an EIA.
Yeah.
Which means that with the current situation faced by the power plant in Norocchole, I'm a little skeptical that the community and the public at large would readily approve all of those, tick all those boxes to allow a new power plant to go ahead. There's a few other issues. The number that they mentioned here was based on a plant load factor of 80%. That means that this plant, the existing plant, has done all these good things to the nation on the basis that it has been running at 80% of its capacity. The actual fact is, it's been running at 60% and no more.
Right.
So there's a lot of distortion here that I think it's not fair on the Cabinet of Ministers to actually mislead them.
But the Cabinet of Ministers, surely they're not going to have this kind of knowledge.
They're not, which then leads us to the next issue. Now here there's the proposal for the funding of this new plant is said to be on a loan from the relevant banks in China, it says, because the contractor is earmarked to be the Chinese contractor. That's the constructor of the current plant. Now, the current plant is not a model of success.
Right.
It is in fact going to be shutting down in the next few weeks for 100 days, which is a long time for a baseload plant to be shut down, a firm power plant to be shut down. But also, this doesn't confirm here whether the Finance Ministry has acknowledged the fact that we have the fiscal space to borrow another $500 or $600 million US dollars.
In plain English, do we have the money?
In plain English, do we have the money?
Right,
Yes.
which we obviously don't.
Yeah. So then your question, which is the due diligence that should be exercised by the Cabinet of Ministers, it is lacking in this particular instance, because this plant has been tabled, the paper has been tabled. I am not entirely sure of its approval status or its ratification status, but to me this paper does not contain the whole truth.
The Cabinet of Ministers are not, they're politicians. I was about to say professional politicians, but anyway, they're politicians. And they are not, they don't have the expertise, which is why you have permanent secretaries and so on. And according to the Governor of the Central Bank, Dr. Indrajit Kumar Swamy, these permanent secretaries are no more permanent secretaries in the way that we used to know them. They are politically motivated appointments, and Dr. Kumar Swamy says for the Central Bank, at any rate, it would be best if they had people who are not through that system anymore, but coming straight from something like maybe the Constitutional Council, so that you get independence there. So it appears the same in not only the Ministry of Power, but in most ministries, where the permanent secretaries are no more permanent, but they're politically motivated or politically appointed, so that they will do as they are told by the minister, who is obviously political. End of line is that the public tend to suffer because there's lack of professionalism. But what can really be done to address this problem?
So that problem does exist in Sri Lanka. It doesn't exist in India because the bureaucracy there is very strong, it's entrenched. Ministers come and go, but secretaries and directors general stay. That's a good model to follow, I think, for continuity of governance and policies and principles, but it doesn't address the issue of technical expertise, Faraz, because a secretary may come from a background different to the subject that that person is tasked with administering.
Right.
Now, in that instance, regulation of a sector, while it doesn't require huge expertise, requires technical knowledge. And my concern, and the concern of several people in the energy sector, is yet another cabinet memo that purports to undermine that requirement. Now, the public can only see what they see behind the black box, that is any utility, by the regulator's information extraction from that utility and the publication of said information in the public domain. So that's the only way we can get to know what's actually going on in whatever sector it is. In the electricity sector, that thus far has been performed by the regulator of that sector, which is the PUCSL. It's the PUCSL that sets things like reserve margin. It's the PUCSL that determines the mix of energy to determine the least cost. We haven't got to that point yet. No. You asked me that, I haven't answered it to you, because there are other factors that kick in. So all of those things require sector-specific knowledge. It's not rocket science. It has been done in other countries very, very efficiently and very well. But in Sri Lanka, it still seems to be a little confusing, because I am now referring to a cabinet paper that was recently submitted, wanting to take the technical and economic regulatory function from the regulator and place it with the cabinet of ministers. Now here, by doing so, we run the risk of violating several principles of regulation. One is that it should be in the maximum public interest. It should be fair to all stakeholders, and it should meet national objectives. Now, the Cabinet of Ministers is in the ruling government. Even if that power was given to the Parliament, where there is opposition present, you are still not capturing that part of society that is not effectively represented in Parliament. So taking regulatory power of a sector as important as electricity and putting it in the hands of the Cabinet of Ministers, you mentioned expertise. I think there's possibly one minister in the Cabinet who has the expertise to do that job, but he's just one person. Then you have a whole bunch of others who are professionals in some ways, some cases, not professional in other cases, but they come from different backgrounds. So that move is a worrying move for investors and consumers alike, because it allows the politicization of the sector.
The consumers are already up in arms. Now that we finally have someone who not only seems to have the facts but also can explain it to the public, can you also explain why we have, if not the highest, one of the highest bills to pay for our electricity? And also, why are they trying to stop the general public from using solar to help them survive? Actually, is that true? Are they trying to stop? Because I've had conversations with ministry officials, and they deny that there's any move to stop solar.
Can I answer that in two parts?
Yes, please.
The first is cost.
Yeah.
Now, that question depends on who's asking the question.
Consumer.
Yes, which category of consumer? There are at least four.
High-end user, probably.
Right, because so is the issue a matter of cost, or is it a matter of tariff? Because you have the vast majority of Sri Lanka's consumers, low-end consumers, low usage households, that are given, that are sold energy at 1/4 the cost, approximately 1/4 the cost, depending on the mix, of production.
Right.
That is subsidized by overcharging industry. Now, industry is the engine of growth. Industry and commerce are the engines of growth, as is
so
the
low
service
end
sector.
is about 90 units, less than 100 units.
I don't know the exact number,
Right.
but it is costing the consumer of low quantities of electricity a fraction, say a quarter of the cost it takes the government to produce it.
Right.
So if you readjust the tariffs, then this business of cost, yes, it'll increase slightly for the majority, but it'll decrease significantly for the drivers of economic growth. So that's a political decision.
Right.
So we can't blame the utility.
Yeah.
We can't blame the regulator. We can only look at what policy the government takes in terms of distributing its cost of generation amongst the different tariff bands.
Right. We're in conversation with Mr. Salia Wickramasuriya, an energy specialist. And we welcome your questions on by SMS 0772 300 305. Card coming up on your screen now. Many thanks to several questions here. many of them are asking about the same, and they're saying, can Mr. Wickramasuriya tell us about whatever plans they have about for alternative energy production in the future? What do they have any concrete plans for that?
I haven't seen anything other than aspirational, notional targets. By alternative, I'm assuming they mean renewable or indigenous oil and gas, for example. Those are two obvious alternatives to exposing ourselves to imported coal and imported fuel. Two or three things are happening here. One is let's take a look at India, if I may digress briefly. India has set an aggressive target of, by 2030, which is only 10 years from now, they are going to have 50% of their energy dispatched by renewable sources. They are going to have 66% of their installed capacity in renewable plus storage. Their modeling, their planning software, their modeling software has thrown out that at current cost trends, solar plus storage becomes cheaper than coal by the year 2026. Now that seems contrary to everything that's going on here. We must be quite a unique place because in our case, coal continues to seem to get cheaper because there are more and more coal power plants appearing in the as yet to be approved long-term generation plan. So I think the public aspire to having different mixes where renewables increase. The professionals feel that that is the way the world is going. But somehow that is not reflected in the generation plan of the country. Now, another alternative form of energy is natural gas, which I think we should encourage the use of, or at least the induction of, because there is high potential for natural gas production locally. Interestingly enough, we've got several proposals for natural gas, two of which have been selected, and we have been unable to make a simple decision between Party A and Party B without taking that to Supreme Court. To me, that is a reflection of the obfuscation of the procurement process. When you leave room for people to bid conditionally, then you leave room for a lot of unknowns. Now, India doesn't do it like that. India, all you need to give India as a bid is a number. All other conditions are fixed by the government. So there is no room to entertain bidders who have conditions with this, without that, in that case, this case. All those can be priced because they are outside of the box. Inside the box is a number. And India go one step further. They actually have reverse auctions. So they start at the lowest price, just the one number. And all bidders need to press a button when a number that meets their economic return comes up on screen. So it's a reverse auction. That leaves nothing to be negotiated. Well, not much of material. In our case, we have this continuous discussion of Party A versus Party B, and this is cheaper and that is cheaper, loss to nation. I am actually at a loss as to understand how we have not been able to compare two simple bids for two identical things. Energy is a commodity for us. A commodity is eminently tenderable.
Many questions are surrounding the use of solar. Should solar be encouraged? I suppose.
Absolutely, and you bring me to the answer to that first question. The utility says we are not suppressing solar, we are going to start solar farms. But the fact of the matter is that is then going to be utility scale solar, which still comes under the purview of the utility, which comes under the purview of the ministry, which comes under the purview of the cabinet. So it's still eminently politicizable. What the industry wants and what the public want is distributed solar, so that the franchising of energy democracy, where people have the choice. I want to have solar. I would like to have solar on my rooftop, and I will sell the state whatever it needs when I don't need it, and I will buy from the state whatever it needs when I do. That is a different kind of solar, and that is the kind of solar, distributed solar, that we need to be going for because of two things. One is it reduces the size of installed capacity in the utility, which reduces the need for reserve margin.
Right.
It puts solar generation in public domain, and the public have a choice. That's one element of energy security is
Right.
choice.
I'm building a house. If I'm having solar energy, is it advantageous or not?
At the current price,
Yeah.
if you're a high-end consumer, the payback on the average is around 4 years, which
Right.
gives you an ROI, again, without being financially rigorous, of 25%. So the answer is yes.
Right. But if you have a solar system at home, what happens in the night when there's no sun?
First of all, your consumption drops.
Right.
Then, secondly, you will take from the grid.
Okay. So
That's what net metering is all about.
So this is the net metering that everyone's going on about. Is it being sufficiently addressed, do you think?
Well, the Surya Bala Sangramya initiative, excellent initiative by the Ministry of Power and Energy and the CB, was targeting 1 million households.
Right.
There are 21,000 installed.
Okay. All right. Well, there you are. You have the answer there then. Somebody's asking a rather political question. I don't know if Mr. Wickramasuri can answer that. Why the uneducated cabinet, for God's sake? I don't know. Do you want to venture
I would like
that?
to answer that question. I don't want to comment on the cabinet, but I think the cabinet of any country, any cabinet of any country, must seek professional guidance before it makes its final decisions. Nobody can expect the cabinet to have knowledge of the sectoral papers. Nothing simple goes to cabinet. So cabinet must have a means of effective sectoral consultation which is accountable before it makes its approval. That's my humble opinion.
What is the right mix? Somebody's asking, what is the right mix for energy security, and where is the LNG? What's happened to LNG?
The right mix is time dependent, going over the future. Most countries are increasing the mix of renewables because the cost of resources is zero. If the cost of any resource is zero, the economic benefit of using it is greater. What needs to develop and what is developing rapidly is means of managing that induction. LNG has to be imported. L is liquefied, liquefied is imported. NG, which is what is used, natural gas, is something we must encourage because Sri Lanka has extremely high natural gas potential. It's not
Commercially viable.
Commercially viable, yes. The caveat to that is who's going to buy it? To deliver commercial return, you need to be connected to a market.
Right.
So in order to get return on investment, the investor, the prospective investor that we are trying to attract, and by the way, we are talking to some big international super major companies, and that's not because they have a love for Sri Lanka, they see commercial potential. But in order to execute those transactions, we need to give them market assurance. In other words, since we're not connected to any other source of market or sale of gas, this government needs to say, yes, we want to buy. So that comes into direct conflict with plans to enter into long-term energy supply contracts for LNG, because then where's the market space you offer somebody who is going to produce NG?
Right.
Does that make sense?
Kind of. But unfortunately, we've had such a wonderful time that all the time's gone, and we're also used up a little bit of time into what we call extra time. But we wonder if you will come on our lengthier program. It's in the English language. Face the Nation. We'll be delighted, I'm sure, to have you to discuss this very important subject. Thank you very much, and thank you for all the questions. And I'm sorry I couldn't take them all, but most of them, they're all about the same, really. Somebody wanted to know whether the energy prices will come down. Well, keep tuned in to News First, and Face the Nation or Newsline will try and give you those answers. But in the meantime, Salih Wickramasuri, thank you very much for being on our program.
Thank you, Faraz. Thank you.
We really appreciate the expertise. And that's the way it was on Newsline today. Thank you for watching. Send us your questions. And of course, take care and God bless.
News First Newsline with Faraz Shaukat Ali.